September 19th sees the release of Rambo: Last Blood, the fifth Rambo movie. To mark the occasion, we will go back and provide retrospective reviews of each of the earlier four movies. In this video, we'll be discussing the first sequel, First Blood Part 2. And joining me for that are Tom Connors.
Hello.
And special guest star, Matthew Kadish, author of the Earthman Jack books.
Hey everybody, how you doing? Thanks for having me on.
So guys, we've already established what we think about Rambo in general and our thoughts on the first movie, First Blood. Now we've gotten to the second movie with the inventive title First Blood Part 2. What do you think about that? Matt, let's begin with you.
So the sequel, Rambo First Blood Part 2, is really the movie that kind of cemented the character of Rambo as a larger-than-life super soldier, whereas the first movie was kind of very grounded and realistic. This is the movie that really kind of took Rambo to the next level in terms of how pop culture and society perceives him and treats him. This is, the Rambo with his shirt off, with the rippled muscles, carrying the gigantic rocket launcher. This is the Rambo that uses explosive arrows to basically blow up half the jungle. This is the one-man army. This is the movie that had that iconic moment where Rambo is under duress talking to the CIA guy who betrayed him, and he says, "I'm coming for you," So this is really the movie where we start to see the evolution of Rambo into that parody that Andre talked about in the previous video, that his country saw the character as. And it's actually a pretty good movie in the sense that it carries on a lot of the themes from the first film in terms of anti-establishment, the government using people, and kind of the struggles of the everyman, the blue collar guy. But it also kind of takes it to this more kind of typical 80s action fare in the sense that Rambo does start to become larger than life. And he eventually becomes the character that we see in the third movie, where he basically takes on the entire Russian army, and he's just a one-man, killing machine. So in the first movie, it's interesting to note that he doesn't kill anyone. Like, he does a lot of violence, but he doesn't cross that line. But in this movie, he kills a lot of people, and he has no compunction about it. And it's kind of like they wanted to show the character back in his environment, like the jungles of, I believe this one takes place in Thailand. The jungles there are very reminiscent of Vietnam, and we get to see him kind of shed the trappings of modern society and go back to simple stuff. Like, instead of guns, he uses a bow and arrow. Instead of other stuff, he uses a knife. He's very down to the basics, and it's one of those movies where it's just fun. It's a fun action movie, and it carries on a lot of the stuff from the first film, and it kind of sets the stage for how this character kind of permeated the culture, the fabric of our culture, in such a unique way.
Do we get to win this time?
Yeah, that's a great line too. That part where he says, "Do we get to win this time?" That's such an iconic line.
Tom, your thoughts?
Oh, so Rambo First Blood Part 2. Very interesting title, as Andre said. I remember this movie coming out. The first trailer dropped like late 84, I want to say. And I think it was actually on the First Blood video, because it took a lot longer for movies to come to video back then. And I just remember it being one of those movies that just exploded, and pun intended. Ironically, I think it's based on a synopsis that was created by James Cameron. So this movie shares a lot of, I will compare Rambo First Blood Part 2 with Aliens a lot of the time, because Alien and Aliens and First Blood and Rambo First Blood Part 2 are very similar in the sense that you have two very different films about the same thing. or at least same characters, environment, stuff like that, or whatever you want to call it, in the same universe. The first film is very serious, dark, and there's a lot going on there in that area, as to where, like, the first Alien is darker and considered more of a horror film. When you get to Aliens, it's more of an action, fun, popcorn kind of movie in a lot of ways. That's kind of the same thing we get here with Rambo First Blood Part 2. It's a lot bigger action set pieces and popcorn movie in a lot of ways, and this movie really cemented the character beyond just the first movie was one of those movies that was like really good. This movie is the one that made Rambo the stereotypical iconic character that we know.
Yeah, and it is interesting to point out that James Cameron, he had an influence on this story, but Sylvester Stallone was also writing this movie as well. So it was kind of like their collaboration that created the most iconic version of this character.
Yeah, and of course, as we said before, do we get to win this time? And that's the big thing about this movie. This came right on the heels of Rocky IV.
Mm-hmm.
And Rocky IV made, like, everybody feel like Rocky single-handedly ended the Cold War himself.
Yeah. So, and the cool thing about the way that this is structured, you saw it with John Wick, where basically all 3 John Wick movies right now are basically the same story. It's like you could watch those back to back, and it's one movie. Same thing with The Godfather. Like you watch those back to back, it's all one big movie. And I think what they were going for here, if you watch Rambo First Blood and then Rambo First Blood Part 2, it's like one long movie. Now that changes with Part 3, but these are kind of the 2 films that are truly sequels to one another. Part 2 is just carrying on from basically where the first movie left off, and I really enjoy that aspect of it, because it continues Rambo's character arc from the first movie and kind of shows him kind of accepting who he is and what he's become and what he needs to be. So that's what I really like about this movie, is that it just kind of continues where the last one left off, and takes it up to 11, turns that knob up to 11. So.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and to finish what I was saying, there is, like, Sylvester Stallone had single-handedly ended the Cold War in America's eyes with Rocky IV. Now he was going to go back and fix Vietnam in Rambo 2, which, in a lot of people's eyes, I think that they kind of felt like a very, in a way, he kind of did lift America back up after that situation, and it did kind of feel like this guy single-handedly went in there and kicked ass for us and took the war back and got our POWs out. And, it was a very symbolic, film at the time, especially in America, where and just to go beyond that, as far as the film itself, like, Matt was saying, it was bigger than the first movie. I mean, there was a rarity in Hollywood where you had a sequel that outgrossed the first film at this time. I know now it's like the common thing, but back then it was not a very common thing. And Rambo 2 is one of the few movies out of that era that you can hold up and say this is one of the few that grossed more than the first film did. So the film itself, as we've kind of brought up, the synopsis, the movie is Rambo's in prison after the first film's events, of course, and Troutman comes to him and tells him that there's some POWs that need saving. And he's only supposed to go take pictures and prove that they're there. But of course, Rambo has other motives in mind, and he's going to go back and he's going to single-handedly win the Vietnam War for us. And I have to correct you, this movie, even though I think it may have been filmed in Thailand or something like that, or starts out in Thailand, but it does take place in Vietnam. So yeah, he goes back to Vietnam and saves some POWs, and then goes back and shoots up the CIA's computers, as Matt says. But yeah, I like this movie. It's not as good as the first film.
What's interesting is that there are a lot of parallels between this film and Avatar, in the sense of, like, the typical white man comes into a different culture, learns to appreciate it, falls in love, and has to fight these encroaching forces that mean to change it or exploit it or something along those natures. So a lot of James Cameron themes kind of carrying through this, a lot of the environmentalist messages that he likes to put into his films, where Rambo basically kind of eschews modern technology, and the finale of the movie is basically him destroying all technology in the film, and kind of walking off into the sunset. But I just find that interesting because, like, we talked about the writing of the first film, and the writing of this film is very James Cameron-ish if you really kind of dig down into it.
Oh yeah, and that's why it's easy to make the parallel comparison between this and the Alien films, at least the first two anyway. So Andre, you've been the most quiet so far. Rambo 2 First Blood, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I haven't got nearly as much to say about it as you guys. What I will say is the first time I saw it, I actually found it to be somewhat disappointing because I was expecting this super over-the-top action. And it was. But it wasn't in a kind of like boring, super patriotic way that didn't quite click with me at the time. So when I first saw it in the 90s, I didn't fully appreciate it, but I was too young to understand it. I saw it too early. When I rewatched it later, being fully aware of the context and also more savvy in terms of film and story structure and stuff like that, I came to really appreciate it. And these days, I'm a huge fan of that movie too. Not nearly as big a fan as I am of the first movie, but I still really appreciate First Blood Part 2. As you say, because of the script. Because it's such a flawless sequel to the first movie that just carries on so organically, so naturally, with Rambo in jail, which is like the perfect way that the movie should begin. I also understand more of what James Cameron was doing with it. Well, not just James Cameron, but what James Cameron and Stallone were doing with the movie. I kind of course, I have to see it from an outside perspective. I'm not there. I'm not part of the culture. I don't know the scars that Vietnam left on the American psyche. I've never felt that. So I can only guess. And also this thing with missing prisoners of war, I guess that must be like a thing because there were so many movies about that. You had like the missing in action movies with Chuck Norris and everything. So I guess that must have been some kind of a thing.
Yeah, it was in
back to get the guys that were still left. But
yeah, I think that's what set the story off originally. Was something going on in the news at the time? Because there was a lot of POWs that were still in Vietnam and stuff at the time.
Yeah, those are like things that I only have to like try to glean from the movie because that's a context that I'm not fully aware of. But just from what you get from the movie, I think it's really efficient. I think it set out to do a certain thing, and it did it, and it did it with perfection. So I really appreciate the movie. I like it a lot these days.
Yeah, but you do see kind of the parody bits to come where, you have that iconic scene where Rambo's got the explosive arrow, and there's that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's that level too, because what I appreciate with it again is the story elements and how I guess it must have been the right movie at the right time when you look at the box office. But again, I would say that it's a little bit like Batman Forever in that here the descent into madness begins. Here you start that journey into the really, really over-the-top things, which at least in my neck of the woods ended up hurting the movie. It might have been big at the box office at the time. And again, the impression that we have of Rambo is of this over-the-top Superman. Yeah. And that obviously came from this movie right here, and then it was further cemented by the third movie. And I don't think it's a very good look because it kind of like undercuts the seriousness of the first movie, and it wasn't until the fourth one that it kind of like got corrected and you lost kind of that impression of it.
But it is interesting where you have movies like Hot Shots, for instance, and Tom, I know you'll have something to say about this, where basically like they start straight up lampooning Rambo, and in a way, like they redid that iconic, explosive arrow scene in that movie in such a brilliant and funny way, and in a way that parody kind of helped to cement Rambo even further into our culture because
Hot Shots Part 2 is basically Rambo 3. It
Yeah.
is the same fucking movie to the point where they even have Richard Crenna in it.
And Charlie Sheen was a great,
It is almost beat for beat the same damn movie.
Yeah, that's like what I'm saying too. That here, my neck of the woods, at the time when I was there in the 90s, people couldn't tell the difference between the parody in Hot Shots Part 2 and UHF and the real Rambo movies, because that was exactly the impression that we had.
But Rambo First Blood Part 2, it does continue on with, it fleshes out the character. It shows him fall in love. It shows how Ward continues to take things from him and how he responds to that, by basically hijacking a helicopter and blowing up half the jungle. But despite all that, there is still the core of this movie is the character of John Rambo. And I think that's what ties First Blood Part 1 and First Blood Part 2 together so well, is that we continue on with this journey and we see him get to win finally by the time this movie's over, even though even though he lost this woman that he came to love. He kind of found his purpose and figured out who he was by the time this movie's over. And that probably brings us into what is the third movie where things just go completely off the rails. But
we'll get into that.
We'll talk about that in a little bit, I guess.
Yeah, so be sure to join us for the third video where we'll be going deep into the third movie. So that should be fun.